World War II. Early victories 1939, 1941. When the spring of 1940 came, Adolf Hitler unleashed his armies in the West, and the world witnessed military victories of astonishing speed and magnitude. On the 9th of April 1940, Germany struck north, invading Denmark and Norway in a surprise move to secure iron ore supplies and flank Britain's naval blockade. Denmark surrendered within a day. Norway, aided by British and French contingents, held out 2 months but succumbed by June. Even as those campaigns concluded, Hitler turned his focus to his most audacious strike yet: the defeat of France and the domination of Western Europe. On the 10th of May 1940, Germany launched Fall Gelb, Case Yellow, the long-feared offensive in the West. Hitler approved a bold plan devised by his generals and refined from World War I lessons. Instead of a repeat of the static trench warfare of 1914-18, German panzer divisions smashed through the Ardennes forest, a region the Allies had thought impassable to armor. Bypassing the strong French Maginot Line defenses, the German armor emerged in northern France, encircling the bulk of the Allied armies in Belgium. In a matter of days, the Wehrmacht achieved what Germany hadn't in 4 years of the previous war. They effectively defeated France. The Blitzkrieg was an unbelievable success. The Netherlands fell in just 5 days. Belgium lasted barely over 2 weeks. In late May, the British Expeditionary Force, along with many French soldiers, found themselves trapped against the sea at Dunkirk. In a now legendary evacuation, the British managed to rescue over 300,000 troops by boat across the English Channel, but they left behind nearly all heavy equipment. France fought on a while longer, but German troops entered Paris on the 14th of June 1940. An armistice was signed on June 22 inches, the very railway carriage where the 1918 armistice had been signed, a symbolic revenge choreographed by Hitler. He even stood in the same spot Marshal Foch had in 1918 to observe the French delegation sign the terms. France was humiliated, divided into an occupied northern zone and a nominally independent Vichy regime in the south. Hitler was at the zenith of his power and popularity after the fall of France. In July 1940, he returned to Berlin in triumph and hosted a massive victory parade. Many Germans who had doubted him were now in awe. He had achieved what no German leader ever had, conquering or cowing all of Western Europe. By this point, only Britain remained defiant. Italy had joined the war on Germany's side in June, hoping to share the spoils. Hitler promoted a dozen of his generals to field marshal in a grand ceremony, feeling that his military genius had been vindicated and perhaps wanting to bask in glory by proxy. Importantly, the quick victory did wonders for morale at home. Rationing and wartime restrictions felt more tolerable when the newsreels showed German troops marching victoriously down the Champs-Élysées. Hitler's personal aura soared. Goebbels' propaganda hailed him as the greatest general of all time, a man of destiny who had brought forth a new order in Europe. But Britain, under the steadfast leadership of Winston Churchill, refused to capitulate. Hitler hoped the British would accept a negotiated peace now that their army was weakened and France gone. Instead, Churchill rallied British resolve. So Hitler turned to the task of compelling Britain's surrender by force. In the late summer of 1940, the Battle of Britain raged in the skies as the German Luftwaffe tried to achieve air superiority to pave the way for an invasion codenamed Operation Sea Lion. Night after night, German bombers hammered London and other cities in the Blitz, hoping to break British morale. It was a dramatic campaign. Cities set ablaze, searchlights crisscrossing the sky, and the drone of bombers and thud of anti-aircraft guns in the darkness. But Britain's Royal Air Force, though outnumbered, fought valiantly. By late September 1940, it was clear the Luftwaffe had failed to defeat the RAF. In a rare setback for Hitler, he indefinitely postponed the invasion of Britain. Britain stood battered but unbowed. In the meantime, Hitler solidified alliances and expanded the war's geography. In September 1940, Germany, Italy, and Japan signed the Tripartite Pact, formalizing the Axis powers alliance. Hitler also sought to bring other countries into his camp. Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria joined the Axis in late 1940 and early 1941. Only two powers now remained unconquered or unsubdued in Europe, Britain in the West and the Soviet Union in the East, the latter still ostensibly a partner due to the 1939 Pact, but in Hitler's mind, the ultimate enemy. By early 1941, a tense calm hung over Europe's battlefields. Germany's conquest of the Balkans was underway. In April 1941, Hitler's forces invaded Yugoslavia and Greece, swiftly overcoming both. But these campaigns, undertaken partly to rescue his faltering Italian ally, who had bungled an invasion of Greece, delayed what Hitler considered his true mission, the attack on the Soviet Union. All the while, Hitler's fanatical hatred of Jews was accelerating Nazi genocidal policies behind the front lines. In Poland, the cramped ghettos were experiencing famine and disease by design. Nazi officials were contemplating more radical solutions. Proposals ranged from mass sterilization to reservations on Madagascar. But as war deepened, these gave way to outright plans for extermination. Yet, at this stage, the actual mass killing of Jews had not yet begun in full. Jews were being concentrated and abused. Thousands had been murdered by SS task forces in 1939, 1940, but not the millions that would come. The decision for the final solution, the systematic murder of Europe's Jews, coalesced alongside Hitler's decision to invade the Soviet Union, a campaign he framed as a war of annihilation against Judeo-Bolshevism. Thus, even in this period of relative lull on the Western Front, Hitler's regime was preparing for both the largest military operation in history and the darkest crime in human history. World War II, the tide turns, 1941, 1943. On the 22nd of June 1941, Adolf Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union. This was the zenith of Hitler's ambition and the fulcrum upon which his war would pivot from triumph to catastrophe. In a pre-dawn address, he proclaimed a crusade against Bolshevism. Without declaration of war, over 3 million German and Axis soldiers smashed across the Soviet frontier along a 1,800-mile front. Hitler saw this not just as another conquest, but as his ideological mission to destroy the Soviet Union, seize its vast lands and resources for Lebensraum, and eradicate what he viewed as the Jewish-led communist threat. He believed a quick victory was at hand, that the Soviet regime would collapse like a house of cards in a matter of months under the onslaught. At first, Barbarossa was staggeringly successful. The Red Army was caught off guard, its planes destroyed on the ground, its forward units enveloped in giant encirclements. By mid-July, German panzer spearheads had driven hundreds of miles into Soviet territory, capturing Minsk and then Smolensk, taking hundreds of thousands of prisoners. In the north, German forces swept through the Baltic states toward Leningrad. In the south, they conquered the rich farmlands of Ukraine. Hitler's war in the east was merciless. Unlike in France or other Western campaigns, here the Nazi leadership made clear that the normal rules of war did not apply. The conflict was framed as a racial and ideological war of extermination. SS death squads, Einsatzgruppen, followed in the army's wake. And by late summer 1941, they were already systematically massacring Jewish civilians, especially in the Baltics and Ukraine, often with local collaboration. Entire Jewish communities were marched out, forced to dig pits, and shot tens of thousands at places like Babi Yar, outside Kiev. Hitler was not present at these massacres, but he was the driving force behind the policy. On the 18th of July 1941, when Himmler asked Hitler what to do with the Soviet Jews, Hitler answered curtly, "Exterminate them as partisans." This chilling directive, noted by Himmler in his diary, essentially greenlit the genocide on Soviet soil. It was perhaps the closest thing historians have to Hitler explicitly ordering what became the Holocaust. Through the summer and into the fall of 1941, Germany's advance seemed inexorable. By September, Leningrad was encircled and under siege. Kiev had fallen in the south, yielding another 600,000 Soviet prisoners. Hitler then made a fateful decision. Instead of striking directly for Moscow in August when his generals urged it, he diverted his main armored forces southward to capture Ukraine's capital and the Crimean oil fields, and northward to help take Leningrad. This pause before Moscow would prove costly. Though Kiev was taken and great prizes seized, the delay allowed the Soviets time to bring in fresh divisions from the east. When Hitler resumed the push toward Moscow in October 1941, rains had turned roads to mud, and soon winter's icy grip began. The Germans slogged forward and by early December were at the gates of Moscow. Some advance units reportedly got within sight of the Kremlin spires. But the offensive stalled in the sub-zero cold. For the first time, the Wehrmacht was stopped. In early December 1941, the Soviets, under General Zhukov, launched a massive counteroffensive, driving the frostbitten Germans back from Moscow. Hitler's gamble on a quick victory over the USSR had failed. The Red Army, though grievously wounded, was not knocked out. And now Germany faced a war on two fronts in earnest, because events on the other side of the world suddenly drew Hitler into conflict with a new, mighty foe. On the 7th of December 1941, Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, bringing the United States into the war. 4 days later, on December 11, Hitler declared war on the United States, even though he was not obligated to under the Tripartite Pact, unless the US attacked Japan first. This seemingly rash act was actually in line with his long-term worldview. He believed the US, with its significant Jewish population and capitalist democracy, was inevitably aligned against Nazi Germany, and he preferred to initiate hostilities on his own terms. Some historians also suggest he hoped Japan would reciprocate by attacking the Soviet Union from the east, though that did not happen. Regardless, with America's entry into the war, Hitler had made the global conflict truly global, and he had added a formidable industrial giant to his list of enemies. By the end of 1941, Germany controlled a vast empire in Europe, stretching from the French Atlantic coast to the outskirts of Moscow, from the Arctic Circle to the North African desert. Yet, this high water mark also concealed cracks. Hitler's swift victories gave way to a grinding war of attrition for which Nazi Germany was ill prepared. In 1942, Hitler's strategy became overambitious and increasingly erratic. Distrustful of his generals after the Moscow setback, Hitler took more direct command of the army, often micromanaging operations from his field headquarters in East Prussia. His health and temperament deteriorated. He was often up late into the night, slept little, and developed a tremor in his hands, possibly Parkinson's disease beginnings or simply stress. To keep going, he relied on a personal physician, Dr. Theodor Morell, who administered a litany of drugs and injections that may have affected Hitler's judgment over time. In the summer of 1942, Hitler launched a renewed offensive in the Soviet Union, this time aimed at the south, towards the oil fields of the Caucasus and the city of Stalingrad on the Volga River. Initially, this offensive made large gains. German troops reached the foothills of the Caucasus Mountains, planting the swastika on Mount Elbrus. But at Stalingrad, named for the Soviet leader himself, the tide of war turned. Hitler became fixated on capturing the city as a symbolic prize. Ferocious house-to-house fighting raged from August into the autumn of 1942. The city was reduced to rubble, but Soviet defenders clung to a shrinking strip of land along the Volga. Hitler forbade his army to retreat, boasting that Stalingrad would fall. It did not. In November 1942, the Soviets launched a massive encirclement operation that trapped the entire German Sixth Army inside Stalingrad. Hitler was warned of the danger beforehand but refused to allow a breakout while possible. He even promoted General Friedrich Paulus to field marshal in the midst of the siege, implying he expected Paulus to fight to the death. No German field marshal had ever surrendered. But as the starving, frozen German troops ran out of ammunition, their situation became hopeless. In February 1943, the remnants of the Sixth Army surrendered against Hitler's orders. Approximately 90,000 ragged German survivors went into Soviet captivity, of whom only a few thousand would ever return to Germany years later. Stalingrad was a catastrophe for Hitler, the first major, undeniable defeat of the Nazi land forces, with some 200,000 Axis soldiers killed and more than 100,000 captured. When news of the surrender was announced, a pall of shock fell over Germany. For Hitler, it was a grievous blow to his prestige. He withdrew from public for some time, entrusting Goebbels to lift morale with the famous Total War speech in Berlin in February 1943. From Stalingrad onward, Hitler's fortunes waned. In July 1943, he insisted on a major offensive at Kursk, attacking a bulge in the Soviet lines with massive tank forces, an attempt to regain initiative. But the Soviets were prepared with deep defenses. The Battle of Kursk became the largest tank battle in history and ended in a decisive German failure. After Kursk, Hitler would never again launch a strategic offensive in the east. The Red Army seized permanent initiative. Meanwhile, in North Africa, the Axis had surrendered in May 1943, and the Allies invaded Italy in the summer, toppling Mussolini, an event that deeply disturbed Hitler. The war was now clearly turning against Germany. Hitler's leadership style under strain became increasingly autocratic and delusional. He refused to visit bomb-devastated German cities, spending most of his time secluded in the Wolf's Lair or later in his Berlin bunker, issuing orders that often had little connection to reality. He relieved capable generals and surrounded himself with a shrinking coterie of yes-men. Yet, many Germans still saw him as the embodiment of the nation's will to resist. The propaganda machine continued to portray him as Germany's rock amid the storm, even as he began to rant at his commanders for supposed incompetence when things went wrong. Notably, Hitler's trust in his military judgment overruled professional advice repeatedly. For example, in late 1942, he forbade any retreat on the Eastern Front, insisting his troops hold every inch of ground. This led to unnecessary sacrifices and the eventual loss of even more men and material. An example of Hitler's rigid stance was his infamous stand or die order during the Soviet 1943 offensives, which did at times hold fronts together but at a terrible cost and with no long-term benefit. As Germany's situation deteriorated, opposition to Hitler within his own ranks grew. Several assassination plots were formulated by military officers and diplomats who had come to see Hitler as leading Germany to ruin. The most significant was the 20th of July 1944 plot, in which Colonel Claus von Stauffenberg placed a bomb in Hitler's East Prussian headquarters. The bomb exploded during a conference, killing several officers and badly damaging the conference hut, but miraculously, Hitler survived with minor injuries. The Führer's survival seemed almost uncanny, bolstering the myth of Providence protecting him. In a furious vengeance, Hitler ordered a thorough purge. Over 4,900 people were executed or arrested in connection with the plot. He demanded that some conspirators be hanged with piano wire, their deaths filmed for him to watch. The failed assassination attempt left Hitler more convinced than ever of his mission and also more isolated. Trust between him and the officer corps was irreparably broken, replaced by an atmosphere of suspicion and fear. On the battlefronts, 1,944 brought the final blows. In June, the Western Allies launched D-Day, the invasion of Normandy, France, opening a long-awaited second front. Despite Hitler's orders to throw the invaders back into the sea, the Allies established a beachhead and then broke out across France. Paris was liberated by August 1944. In the east, the Soviets in summer 1944 unleashed Operation Bagration, an offensive that annihilated Germany's Army Group Center and swept westward hundreds of miles, liberating Minsk and reaching the Vistula River in Poland. Germany's situation was militarily hopeless. Allied armies were approaching from both west and east. The Reich cities were under relentless aerial bombing, and resources were dwindling. Yet Hitler refused any suggestion of surrender or negotiation. To the end, he clung to a belief in a final victory, or at least the notion that if Germany lost, it deserved to perish. In his mind, it was all or nothing.